Okay, well, welcome to our next session, Empowering You for Purpose. Today we're going to consider the spiritual secular divide in some more detail. We've touched on that in previous sessions, but we want to dig into that a bit more today. And in previous sessions, we've referred to the comprehensive, sort of all-inclusive biblical view of the universe. Colossians 1 talks about Jesus being the firstborn over all creation, for in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth. All things have been created through him and for him. So everything is for him, for his glory. Centuries after the Apostle Paul wrote those words down, Abraham Kuyper, who was a Dutch theologian, but also became Prime Minister of Holland, he said something similar. He said, there is not a square inch of the universe over which King Jesus does not claim mine. So we have this comprehensive view given to us in Scripture, but also over the course of church history. But for many believers today, this comprehensive view has been obscured, where the world is divided into two compartments: the sacred, the spiritual life, things which are considered eternal, and then everything else which is in the second compartment, the secular compartment. So we think, well, okay, what's the big deal? But if we, as believers, have life split into these two compartments, we live in essentially two different worlds. This has very profound consequences. So an invisible line separates personal faith in Jesus and other things that go along with that: church attendance, worship, prayer, Bible study, things such as those things, and everything else, other areas of life, work, leisure time, caring for our physical body, and other so-called secular activities, which the assumption is that these really don't matter to God. God isn't really interested in all of these things. He's just interested in the spiritual life, just what happens on Sundays in church meetings and so on. So as a result, Christianity is narrowed down to spiritual salvation only, in effect. It's just a ticket to heaven and not much else. So when SSD, spiritual secular divide, or this virus, we're living in these days of viruses, this is a very significant virus in itself. When this takes hold within a church, the church becomes separated from its surrounding culture, because Christians end up then in a kind of Christian ghetto with its own subculture of its own language, has its own media and songs and entertainment. Sunday worship services are seen as the most important thing during a week, more important than what you do during the rest of the week. And full-time Christian service, quote, end quote, is valued more than engaging in the arts or in law or politics or education or in another sphere of society. And as a consequence of that, God's people are ineffective in impacting the culture. When the church seeks to impact society, the values and dominant beliefs of the surrounding culture begins to influence and shape it. And as a good friend of mine has said, when the church isn't discipling the nation is discipling the church. So I'm going to pause there, Roger.
That's great, great summary, Stuart. And so, yeah, that's sacred secular divide, or spiritual secular divide, SSD. It's interesting, actually. Mark Green, there's a little book, it'll probably be backwards on your screen, but it's The Great Divide, little booklet by Mark Green, 2010. That's from the London Institute of Contemporary Christianity. And he called this, as Stuart mentioned, he called it a pandemic, which is quite ironic, obviously, today with COVID and so on. And he said it's in the church's bloodstream. It's been in the church's bloodstream for nearly 2 millennia. And it's not easy to overcome. It's a potent virus, as Stuart was saying. And it's interesting, we'll probably come back to this more, but it's interesting, those roots of the SSD, that it's from Greek thinking, especially Plato. That's before Jesus. And, you know, even our word, the ideal, comes from Plato's idea of the idea, which is sort of superior, it's sort of sacred, it's not world, it's not the matter, it's not secular, which is sort of corrupt. And that's therefore Platonic thinking. And it came into the Christian church through various thinkers, but I suppose one of the most important was probably Augustine. So that's sort of 354 to 430 AD, through something called Neoplatonism. And it led to this great divide that Stuart's been talking about. And that great divide sort of splits and fragments the world. So again, Mark Green somewhere else would say that the whole biblical Hebraic worldview is more like a peach, you know, whole, whereas the Greek sacred secular divide is more like an orange with all its different segments and fragments. It's fragmented. And yet, actually, all of that in the Hebraic biblical worldview is equally important in God's eyes. So Genesis 1, for example, 31 says, you know, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And Stuart started off with those favorite verses of mine that I mentioned a couple of times in previous, with Colossians 1. And it's so interesting that it says it 8 times, you know, that Jesus created, he holds together, he reconciles everything, all things. It's trying to make the point, I think. So with the, it's been interesting seeing the effect of this virus, where following through some of that thinking from the London Institute of Contemporary Christianity, so Mark Green and those sort of guys, that they talk about the church being gathered on a Sunday and then scattered. That's the language they use, Monday to Saturday. And they say, I think rightly so, that SSD, this SSD pandemic, sacred secular divide, leads to an emphasis on the gathered church. So as Stuart was saying, on that spiritual activity, worship, sermons, prayer, rather than on secular, which is the rest of the week. But they have calculated at a rough guess that, and I'm deliberately saying this, that everyday Christians spend probably 110 hours a week scattered. If you think maybe they get 48 hours sleep, maybe 5-10 hours working with the church out of 168 hours in a week. And yet that's not the emphasis in the church. And it's been interesting. It just really struck me actually just a couple of weeks ago, the difference between Acts chapter 1, verse 8, where Jesus says, go, and he says, go actually to the ends of the earth. But even his early disciples, actually, they stayed in a gathered way in Jerusalem, and they didn't go. And it was only persecution that eventually sent them out. And the contrast to Acts chapter 1, verse 8 is Acts chapter 8, verse 1, where it uses for the first time the word scattered, that they were scattered throughout the Roman Empire. And, you know, it's interesting today with that word, that mention of pandemic and virus, that with the pandemic of COVID-19, that maybe that will help defeat the SSD pandemic. Now, what on earth am I talking about when I say that? But it's been interesting to notice over these months that the scattered church and the scattered servants, as Alan Scott calls them, is sort of the emphasis, really, that gathered church has had to be massively curtailed. And certainly all over Bristol here, you know, you've seen people popping up It has been a word actually with one of the big churches. They're saying they have their pop-up services dotted, scattered geographically around, and an emphasis on that scattered rather than the gathered. And I'll say a bit more on that a bit later. But Stuart, back to you.
Yeah, it's all very interesting to see how over history God sometimes has to break in or use certain events. You know, he didn't orchestrate the persecution. He didn't orchestrate, I don't believe, this pandemic, but he will use those things for his purposes. And I mean, this SSD is not only prevalent in much of the church, it's also found in the mission world, in which, you know, I've been very much a part of for a long period of time. It's a very invasive thing. So in the Christian ministry world, you can separate ministry activities into higher and lower categories. So if you're engaged in overseas mission, a question often is asked, where are you working? Are you working in a 1040 window nation? And what that means is it a nation that falls within 10 degrees or 40 degrees north of the equator, the lines of latitude? Because that section of the world that's been identified have the least evangelized people, the poorest people, the kind of focus of other major world religions are all in that window that's been labeled the 1040 window. So it's seen as a greater priority, and even not necessarily are these words said that is more important, but it is implied that if you're really spiritual, then you're working in the 1040 window. Yeah. So again, you have this kind of division that is created, which is you know, another form of this dualistic thinking. But on the positive side, God is restoring to the church a more all-encompassing redemptive agenda, the big picture, the big purpose, which is what these Zoom sessions are all about. And we're still very much been laying the foundation before getting into how people can be empowered to engage within their particular area of involvement in society with their passions, their gifting, and so on. But it's important to understand the roots and the foundation to what is actually in place and why we've got to that stage before sort of getting into some of the more practicalities. But he is inviting all of us to join him in his mission, and it is a holistic mission, and it therefore requires a holistic mindset, which is truly liberating and empowering, because it sets us free from that debilitating mental dualism, this virus, this other pandemic that Roger's talking about, and it enables every believer then to enjoy life in its fullness, in its wonder, and to engage according to the way God has made each of us uniquely with our own gifts and passions and calling. And that in itself becomes a wider concept, rather than calling just being a call to missionary work or a call to pastoral ministry or a call to church planting, all these things which are very recognizable in the spiritual secular kind of mindset. And those are valid, of course, those are valid callings, but the calling becomes something that is applicable to every believer, that every believer has a calling. Every believer needs to be equipped in that calling and commissioned into those spheres of influence, wherever that calling is related to.
Yeah, and thanks, Stuart. And just emphasising the point with the last few comments from me, that, you know, Stuart was saying all of those callings, geographically, you know, wherever it is in the world, are all equally important. So Acts 1 verse 8, when Jesus called his disciples to be witnesses to the end of the world, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the end of the world, that's all of equal importance. It doesn't just have to be that 1040 window or whatever that Stuart was saying. But it's interesting that the local church's view of mission, just to give another perspective on it, is we've used those LICC words of sort of gathered, and often the church would see itself impacting missionally, sort of locally together, all working together in their local community, and that would often be social action. So you may have soup runs or food banks or winter night shelters or whatever. I'm not knocking those, that's all good. But they may also then have a view of mission that Stuart's mentioned, where you're sort of praying or financially supporting sort of so-called missionaries, overseas, for example, in Africa. But they're not praying for the church to go into the whole of life. And in my upbringing, the church, I always understood it as the people and not the building. It's about where the people find themselves the whole time. And so it'd be strange, really, but this is often the case. So the Sunday school teacher will be prayed for in church, in the gathered worship setting, but they may be teachers throughout the rest of the week in a so-called secular, scattered setting, but will never once be prayed for in church. And for me, certainly, I was prayed when I went to teach in Africa, prayed for and anointed and all of that at the front of the church, but I wasn't ever prayed for as a teacher in the years in Bristol. And that just shows that sort of sacred secular divide.
Yeah.
But I would like to say, I think, we're called to be witnesses, not just geographically, but also not just in geographical people groups. So, I mean, my wife and I spent 6 years in Zambia, and that was great. So I'm not knocking that. I'm just saying it isn't only that. But I think there are people groups also in every aspect of life, every sphere of life. So in Bristol, we got those 8 spheres that I've mentioned before, sport, health, education, family, politics, social action, the arts, media, business and workplace. And my sports sphere guys tell me that 80% of people in the UK are what they call sporty minded. And there's a whole people group that you can reach. And similarly with the creatives, with the arts or with social action, in business. And so just to bring my thoughts to a close, really, is a couple of thoughts, again, back to Mark Green and the London Institute of Contemporary Christianity. He calls this SSD, Sacred Secular Divide, a pandemic, as we've said, a potent virus. And it's been diagnosed, he says, but it's very hard to defeat. And he quotes 1954, so nearly 70 years ago, the World Council of Churches, where they say the real battles of faith today are being fought in factories, shops, offices and farms, in political parties and government agencies, in countless homes, in press, radio and television, in the relationships of nations. Very often it is said that the church should go into the spheres, but the fact is that the church is already in the spheres in the persons of the laity. Even that idea of clergy and laity is dualistic discuss.
Yeah.
Nearly 70 years later, and then Mark Green will say this, globally, 98% of Christians are neither envisioned nor equipped for mission in 95% of their working lives. Then he says, but just imagine if they were. And I guess that's what Stuart and I are passionate about, is how do we help equip the saints? So Ephesians 4 verse 12, where it says, preparing, in the NIV, preparing God's people for works of service. And that's often interpreted as just being in the church. But it's not. It's in the whole of life. It's gathered and it's scattered. And Stuart and I are both coaches. We're both passionate to help people to find their purpose, their godly purpose, and to soar like eagles in whatever aspect of life that is. And it's all equally important. And so I suppose that sort of summarizes our thoughts for this particular session. I don't know if you've got any comments or thoughts at all. I mean, Paul, ever so welcome to come in with some thoughts, but no problem if you don't want to, obviously. Stuart and I may have some other thoughts as well. But Paul, I mean, for you first, I don't know if you've got any questions or comments or insights that you'd like to share, or things that you totally disagree with, anything.
No, I'm basically 100% behind the vision you're articulating here. I think the problem started a bit before
For Plato, or
well, yeah, I think it got into the church really quite early, but yeah, the problem. One of the problems was that the Greek was the cultural vehicle for reaching the world, and so you had to speak Greek, which meant that you had to use Greek terminology, which meant that you had to borrow Greek philosophical terms for communicating the gospel, and those terms came preloaded with a whole load of stuff from Plato and the other philosophers, and in aiming to communicate with the people around, early Christian apologeticists would emphasize the connections between the message they were proclaiming and the ideas that were current in society, to help people understand and relate to it, which is what we tend to do even today, and that has the knock-on effect that they don't necessarily get the distinctive nature, the difference of the gospel message that Jesus was bringing, as opposed to the Greek philosophers.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Yeah.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. So it was a gradual process, I think, in the early church, and perfectly understandable reasons, but it's possibly something that the church wasn't aware of as it needed to be, and once Constantine got converted, then the pressure to adopt the mainstream worldviews really, the church was not in a position to battle that.
No.
Yeah, I think Paul, I'm just going to mute you a minute because there's some background noise from you. I think you highlighted Constantine in the 4th century. That was another significant point, of course, because that changed so much in terms of institutionalization of the church and power and control and structures and all of that. So the clergy laity divide really was emerged out of that whole system that developed when Christianity was recognized within the Roman Empire. And so you have the minister as being the one that had the influence, had the power, he had the authority, he was the one that spoke. And so the rest of God's people were then considered really not ministers. And even through the Protestant Reformation, so many centuries later, which brought the word of God to every person, common man, the work of God didn't come to the common man. It was still kind of left very much in the hands of the church leaders and those that were ministers, those that were bishops, those that had been appointed. And so this clergy laity split then really just continued for much of church history from that time, with some exceptions. I mean, William Carey, for example, he was somebody that after Wesley saw how the gospel was to be engaging within society. Even Luther said, you know, if the gospel does not address the issues of the day, the issues of society, then it is not the gospel at all. It's not the true gospel. Wesley very much was engaged in transforming society, was significantly used by God to impact and turn Britain around in so many ways. And then William Carey, the father of modern missions, so-called, you know, saw what Wesley and others had done within England, and when he went to India, thought, well, that can happen in India too. And he engaged in literally every key sector of Indian society. So there were clear role models, if you like, through church history that we have that had this all-embracing, all-comprehensive, holistic view, biblical worldview. But then at different times it would just fall back into the kind of default Platonic dualistic mindset. I just want to make one other comment before handing it back to whoever wants to pick up on it. I mean, Roger mentioned churches engaging at a local level through social action and food banks and so forth, and then at the international level, overseas mission. But then this gap that so often exists where sectors of society are not seen as mission fields, if you like, in their own right. Yes, of course, people are reaching out to people within those sectors, you know, through personal sharing, evangelism, even looking to see people experience personal salvation from within education, from within the arts world and business and so forth. But we don't view the arts and entertainment sphere as an entity in itself or as a mission field in itself to actually reach out to and disciple that, or the business and economic world to be discipling people in that sector, not just at an individual level, but the sector as a whole. Discipling education, which in the past, of course, it was. I mean, education really was, the foundation was biblical. Universities throughout the UK, throughout the US and other European nations often were built on a Christian foundation, were centers of learning the scriptures, learning the truth. You know, the motto for Oxford University is, "The Lord is my light," Psalm 27:1. So that, of course, has been largely lost through secularization, but it was there. So this is not anything new. It's founded in New Testament scriptures, and it is evidenced in many different ways through the past 2,000 years of church history, but sadly it has also been lost at different times during that course of history as well.
Stuart, I think it's interesting what you're saying about education there, that an awful lot of the, you know, from monasteries to Oxford, Cambridge colleges to schools, you know, across the UK, across then being spread by missionaries across the world. A lot of the schools were set up by Christians, and I agree with that. And yet, I think, you know, somebody whose background really is in education and who taught in schools in Bristol and then in Zambia as well, you know, can be set up by Christians, but then it's a whole other ball game, I think, to be teaching and educating in Christian worldview ways, or biblical worldview ways. I think often, you know, just the whole Western education system is a very Greek thing where, if you like, the academic, the idea, the mind, the ideal is sort of raised up, and we'd say almost like idolatrously, really. It's given an importance perhaps higher than every aspect of education. And so, in Zambia, in a Christian school, they'll be doing Cambridge and international GCSEs and whatever, where it's the academic that is being emphasized, which is coming from that whole Platonic Greek worldview. And so, although they're sort of
a humanistic worldview that has really taken over, well, Western education and then exported around the world.
Yes, absolutely. And so I think just the whole, even just the whole idea, I'm thinking of something I've mentioned in a previous session, perhaps with John Stott in his book, Issues Facing Christians Today, where, he was passionate, wasn't he, of dual listening, I think he called it, where you're listening to the Bible in one hand and you're listening to the world and events in the other hand, and you're working out, what is, I think he called it a Christian mind, the mind of Christ, and he had a little framework that obviously is just a helpful framework, but to think about any possible issue from a sort of more biblical perspective, where he's talking of creation, the good, the fall that comes along, the mess that's made, and then redemption, and then sort of being put right. And then new creation, which is to do with the future. And obviously, any issue is only fully put right when Jesus comes back. But here, back on a renewed heaven and the renewed earth for the whole of eternity, all of life, every aspect of life, being weighed up in that new Jerusalem, on that new earth, in that renewed earth. What is it? In Revelation, it talks of only the honor and the splendor of the kingdoms will be there. Nothing impure will enter in. So to be thinking about any culture, about any aspect of life, not in a dualistic, sacred, secular way, but in a different way. Is it obedient to God? Is it disobedient to God? Is it following his kingdom values? Is it against his kingdom values? I mean, that's being a bit simplistic, but you can start to discern and weigh up any issue, any topic, with that sort of theme of the fall that goes through, but also redemption that goes, creation and redemption that goes through. You're weighing up the good and the bad, the positive, the negative, in sort of simplistic terms. So I don't know how you feel about that. I mean, Paul, any other thoughts on any of that? Otherwise, I've got a particular little thought and question for you, Paul, but have you got any other thoughts on that first at all?
Yes, I would wholeheartedly agree that the nature of the education that people are offered is very far from biblical, and the nature of the way we do education is very far from biblical. So I think there is an awful lot to rethink and relearn there.
Yeah. And Paul, I know your heart and your passion for many things, but including particularly perhaps sort of the world of social action and politics and so on. And I'm just thinking, even in that world, there's a couple of things I'm thinking that I find these days a lot of Christians sort of get engagement in social action, but don't yet necessarily get engagement in all the other spheres. But also, I suppose, even within social action, you could say there's a sacred secular divide. And I don't know what you feel about this, where, there's the evangelistic, there's the word, and then there's the works, the word and deed, and how the two should be. And is one lost sometimes and the other emphasized? How do you feel that ideal, sorry, I used a Platonic word there, but what do you feel would be the best balance biblically in that world of social action or even politics? I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Well, I think that, in a sense, the question betrays the problem.
Yeah.
That by saying, how do you balance them, you're saying there are two different things that are opposed. Whereas the biblic view is that there is one thing, and it extends in both what we see as the secular and what we see as the sacred, but it is one thing.
Yeah.
The one thing cannot be opposed to itself. So when we're called to love our neighbour, that there isn't a division between loving them and feeding them and loving them and teaching them the truth. You know, those cannot be opposed to each other, because the call is to love the person, the whole person, in whatever way is possible and appropriate, and in, you know, however we can. So there is no balance, and yes. So I've been fighting this one for a very long time, and most Christians, you know, tend to approach the whole social action thing either from the secular perspective of, I want to do good and I hope that people see my faith through the wonders of the actions, or they see it as an excuse to enable you to preach the gospel to these people I've just helped. They do not see that in expressing God's love to people, you know, you are doing a spiritual act. You know, it is a communication of the kingdom, which has value, which has spiritual value and power in and of itself. But equally well, you know, the understanding of what you're doing and why you're doing it also has power. And to deny either the actions or the understanding is to only give half a service, only to half love people.
Yeah. No, brilliant. And I suppose Jesus is our model in that, as always, really, in his public ministry. You know, he was both, if you like, evangelism and sort of social action justice. Matthew 4 verses 23 and 9:35, it says, you know, he both went about teaching and preaching. And then Acts 10:38 says he then went about doing good and healing. There's no split there, is there?
No, and in Matthew 5, he talks about visiting those in prison. You did it to me. You know, helping the poor and needy. You did it to me. He wasn't making that as a lesser, less important than the feeding the spirit, the soul, or the spirit. So it was, yeah, very much a holistic gospel. I think we're about to finish.
Yes,
so we'll make a stop here and pick it up next time.
So next time, Stuart, I think is always the first and the third Monday. So I believe that's Monday, the 2nd of November, if I'm right, at 4:30. So really look forward to that. Paul, great having you with us.
Yeah.
Stuart, thanks so much. Enjoy France. And thanks for leading us again, my friend.
Thank you for everyone for your contributions as well, Roger and Paul. So we'll see you.
Thank you, Paul.
Time.
Bless you.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.